November 2024 will go down as the month that shattered Putin's war machine. His so-called special military operation has turned into a special kind of disaster. Russia isn't just losing troops and tanks, it's losing the ability to fight altogether. Massive casualties, record equipment losses, and a collapsing ruble are hitting Russia all at once, threatening to bring Putin's entire war effort to its knees. This isn't just a bad month, it's the kind of month that could change everything. So why was November 2024 such a turning point, and what exactly went so wrong for Putin? The answer starts with troop losses. A lot of troop losses. On December 1st, the New Voice of Ukraine reported that Russia's army suffered its highest irrevocable and sanitary losses of the war so far in November 2024. The numbers make for terrible reading for Putin. A staggering 45,720 of his personnel were killed or injured during the month, according to Ukraine's defense ministry. That number is roughly equivalent to 3 entire motorized rifle divisions of the Russian army. Equipment losses were equally horrendous for Russia. Ukraine managed to destroy 307 of the country's tanks during November, adding to a tally that had already exceeded 9,500 by the time the month began. Those numbers may not have come as a surprise to Putin. Ukraine's defense ministry says that Ukraine managed to take out 279 tanks back in October, with another 291 falling to Ukraine soldiers in September. That's a 3-month average of a little over 292 tanks, showing that Putin is losing equipment hand over fist, while he's also losing soldiers. Alternatively, we can look at this in tank battalion terms. A single Russian tank battalion contains 31 of these monstrous machines. That means that November saw the country lose nearly 10 of its battalions, with September and October not being far behind. Add it all together, and the last 3 months have seen Putin lose a little over 28 of Russia's tank battalions. The monetary cost of the November tank losses is around $450 million. Add November to September and October, and Russia's financial losses in tanks alone easily tops $1 billion. And the equipment problems don't stop there. In December 2024, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia also sacrificed 899 of its armored combat vehicles and 884 pieces of its artillery to the altar of Putin's special military operation. Again, those numbers add to the already catastrophic equipment losses that Russia has experienced since February 2022. The armored fighting vehicle destruction Ukraine wrought on Russia took the tally up to over 19,500 vehicles lost. Artillery systems lost had already pushed past the 21,000 mark for Russia, with Ukraine's November exploits putting it on the verge of breaking 21,000 pieces of artillery destroyed. The New Voice of Ukraine has the breakdown again. A single division of Russia's army has 18 self-propelled artillery installations. Assuming all 884 of the lost artillery pieces are self-propelled, that means Ukraine spent November 2024 decimating the capabilities of 49 of Russia's artillery divisions. As for the cost, that's another $700 million that Putin has poured down the drain as he tries to batter Ukraine's fortifications into submission. All told, the New Voice of Ukraine says Russia blew through $3 billion in lost equipment and weapons during the month. The country simply can't sustain these types of losses. Okay, so it was a bad month for Russia, you might think, but a single month doesn't mean that the country is on its knees. Perhaps Russia wouldn't care were it not for the fact that the record-breaking November losses came on the back of another month in which Russia broke records. That's right, October was almost as bad for Putin and his cronies in the Kremlin. On November 10th, the BBC reported that the UK's Chief of Defence Staff, Sir Tony Radakin, had called on the country's government to provide more money for its military. His goal is to increase the UK's defence budget from 2.3% of national gross domestic product, or GDP, to 2.5%. What does any of this have to do with Russia? Radakin also touched on Russia's losses for the month while making that call. He told the UK government that Putin was losing soldiers at a rate of about 1,500 every single day. He also pointed out that the country was then on the verge of suffering 700,000 people killed or wounded. The enormous pain and suffering that the Russian nation is having to bear because of Putin's ambition. It wouldn't take long for Radakin's predictions to come true. Russia's troop casualty toll now stands at about 753,000, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. On top of all this, Radakin added, Russia was experiencing those massive losses for tiny increments of land, and is now at a point where it's spending more than 40% of its national budget on the war. So not only is Putin losing his soldiers by the thousands every day, but he's putting an enormous strain on the state, according to Radakin. That gives us 2 record-breaking months of losses for Russia. October 2024 was bad enough. Losing around 1,500 soldiers a day is a casualty rate that Putin should never have allowed to happen. But then November 2024 came along and broke every record that Ukraine managed to set in the previous month. If we didn't know any better, we'd think that Putin was trying to break the back of his own country. Maybe he is. After all, it's not just the massive losses of personnel and the $3 billion in destroyed equipment that make November 2024 Russia's worst month ever. There are several other issues that threaten to cripple the country for good. Sticking with the troop loss issue for the moment, Russia didn't just experience its worst month for total losses in November, it also had to deal with its single worst day, several times. On November 29th, the Kyiv Independent reported that the previous day saw Russia finally break through the 2,000 soldiers lost in a day barrier. Its final tally for November 28th, 2,030 soldiers dead or injured in a single day. And that wasn't even the first time the country had recorded its biggest ever single-day losses in November. Russia had only just set a new record of 1,950 casualties in a day on November 12th, and it had broken the record even before that. On November 11th, Kyiv released figures claiming that Russia had lost 1,770 of its troops on November 10th, which broke the record of 1,740 lost in a single day on May 13th. So what does that mean for Putin? November 2024 saw him break his own record for sacrificing his soldiers 3 times in the space of 18 days. And these weren't tiny increases. The November 12th record shattered the one set on November 10th by over 200 soldiers. The new record set on November 28th is 80 soldiers higher than the one set on November 12th. Russia is being forced to sit back and watch as its death count spirals out of control. And November just went from bad to worse for Putin and his army. On November 18th, news emerged that President Joe Biden had given Ukraine the green light to start using America's long-range ATACMS missiles in Russia. The United Kingdom followed suit by allowing Ukraine to use its Storm Shadow missiles to strike on Russian territory. Both decisions blindsided Putin. He'd hoped that his constant threats of retaliation for crossing this particular red line would have been enough to keep those missiles out of his country. They weren't. And Ukraine wasted no time in taking full advantage of its allies' decision. Just the day after it received approval from the US, Ukraine used its ATACMS missiles to mark the 1,000-day anniversary of the war with a strike on a Russian weapons depot in Bryansk. The attack was designed to take out missiles and artillery that would likely have found their way to the soldiers Putin was using to storm Kursk, meaning it came as a big logistical blow to Russia. About a week later, the Kremlin was also forced to admit that Ukraine had carried out 2 more ATACMS strikes on Russian facilities. Russia's defense ministry claimed that it shot down 7 of 8 missiles fired, with one hitting its target in one strike on an airfield named Kursk-Vostochny. The other strike targeted Russian S-400 positions in Lotarevka, with 3 missiles supposedly shot down while 2 reached their targets. Storm Shadow hasn't been left out of the fight. November 20th brought with it news of a strike using the UK-supplied missiles on what's believed to be a command headquarters in the village of Marino. The Guardian reports that Russian war bloggers believe that Ukraine fired 12 Storm Shadows in the attack, with the strike also believed to have taken out some of the North Korean soldiers Putin has received to supplement his counteroffensive in Kursk. So not only does Russia have to deal with losing record numbers of soldiers in November, but it also has to worry about Ukraine now having access to weaponry that could cause even more losses in December. Could it get any worse for Putin? As it happens, yes, it could absolutely get worse for Russia. As all of this was happening, the ruble was also falling off an economic cliff. Toward the end of November, the ruble cratered against the US dollar. By November 27th, it had fallen to its lowest rate since the beginning of Putin's special military operation, hitting 110 rubles per dollar. That's a stark contrast to the exchange rate in the months before the war, when the ruble traded at between 75 and 80, and the ruble kept falling. By November 29th, it was at 114, marking a 36% decline from the rate of 84 rubles per dollar recorded in August 2024. A small recovery has taken the ruble back below the 110 mark at the time of creating this video, but the currency having such a terrible exchange rate couldn't have come at a worse time for Putin. Sky News reported that panic reigned in the Kremlin as Russia was forced to watch its currency devalue. Kommersant, which is a daily Russian newspaper, said that the news resembled a war report, while telling its readers they needed to stash as many rubles as possible for the economic turbulence that is to come. This massive currency drop came in the wake of a new wave of US sanctions that targeted several Russian banks that allow the country to process international transactions. Gazprom Bank was the hardest hit. The bank, which is Russia's 3rd largest and has ensured that Russia can keep selling its natural gas to Europe, has now lost all of its ability to process transactions with other countries. That's a symptom of Europe spending the last couple of years collectively moving away from Russian gas. And even worse for Russia is that these new sanctions come amidst the country dealing with 8.7% inflation and a base interest rate of 21%, which has caused massive cost of living problems for the Russian population. So November has been a terrible month for Russia. On the battlefield, it's recorded its highest number of troop losses in a single month since the war began. It also broke its own record for single-day losses 3 times during the course of the month. Add to that the collapse of the ruble thanks to new US sanctions, and Ukraine's newly granted ability to use long-range missiles in Russian territory, and you get a month that's broken Russia's back. Let's hone back in on Russia's massive troop losses for November. Why did they happen? The answer likely lies in Russia making even bigger pushes against Ukraine throughout the month. We start with Kursk. In August 2024, Ukraine made the bold move of launching what ended up being a counter-invasion of Russia. Within 2 weeks of launching that invasion, Ukraine controlled 93 villages and around 450 square miles of Russian territory. The move was hailed as brilliant, albeit a big gamble at the time, because taking parts of Kursk would give Ukraine more leverage in any future peace negotiations with Russia. Putin wasn't happy. The Kursk invasion humiliated him and shattered his carefully crafted image as a political strongman who could protect his people. He needed to take the territory back, and he spent much of November 2024 trying to do just that. On November 12th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukrainian forces in Kursk were now holding the line against a counteroffensive containing 50,000 soldiers. Our men are holding back 50,000 of the occupiers' army personnel who, due to the Kursk operation, cannot be deployed to the other Russian offensive directions on our territory, Zelensky announced. The 50,000 troops Putin has deployed in Kursk likely feature the majority of the 11,000 to 12,000 North Korean soldiers Russia has received as part of its cooperative defense pact with North Korea. It's believed that Russia is likely sending military technology and financial support to North Korea in exchange for these troops. Putin has made the ultimate sacrifice of Russian secrets, along with the cash the country can ill afford to spend, to bolster his counteroffensive, and it's working, partly. Russia's November push into Kursk had resulted in it taking back around 40% of the territory it lost by November 24th. But it's this very counteroffensive that also accounts for many of the country's massive losses during its record-breaking month. On November 1st, Pravda reported that Russia had lost 15 battalions, amounting to 8,000 soldiers, since Ukraine took territory in Kursk. By November 6th, amidst the launch of Putin's counteroffensive, that number had exceeded 20,000 troops, along with 1,101 units of weaponry and military equipment, according to Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrsky. More losses followed, with Russia also seeing 17 pieces of military equipment destroyed due to mine explosions during an attempted assault in mid-November. Add Ukraine's ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes in and around Kursk, along with its defense of the territory it's captured against Putin's counteroffensive, and you have a recipe for massive troop losses on the Russian side. And then there's another big ingredient we can add to that recipe. In addition to the Kursk counteroffensive, Russia has been pushing to take more territory in eastern Ukraine. It's been succeeding, in a sense. On November 30th, the New York Times reported that Russian soldiers had managed to take at least 10 villages in the latter third of the month, and were starting to close in on the last 2 strongholds Ukraine has in Donetsk. If those strongholds, Velkaya Novosilka and Kurakova, fall, that would allow Russia to take out the smaller pockets of Ukrainian troops that remain to ultimately take control over Donetsk. But that push has come at a massive cost. According to Operation Strategic Group Khortytsia, which is a unit of the ground forces Ukraine is stationed to the east, Russia's gains in November cost it a staggering amount of troops in eastern Ukraine. The group's spokesman Nazar Voloshin said, "November was a colossal month in terms of losses, and in particular, Russia suffered more than 35,000 casualties in our operational areas over the course of the month." Voloshin also said that the sheer number of Russian attacks in eastern Ukraine had intensified throughout November. "I should note that last week, the enemy conducted 1,156 attacks in our area of responsibility," he says, when referring to the final week of November. This is slightly more than the previous week, when there were 921 enemy attacks. This statement gives us some insight into how Putin is approaching his attempts to take Donetsk. Rather than relying on massive waves of soldiers, he's altered his tactics so that he now has small groups carrying out hundreds of assaults per day. The problem, at least according to Voloshin, is that Russia is deploying many of these small groups without armored vehicles or other key heavy equipment. That makes the groups easy picking for Ukraine soldiers, accounting for the massive casualty rate. It may be a different way of doing it, but it's still Putin's meat grinder approach in action. And therein lies the real reason why Russia has recorded record losses for November. It's now fighting the Ukraine war on 2 fronts, but Putin and his cronies still can't change their strategic approach. They're just throwing more and more soldiers at Ukrainian fortifications in the hope that they will eventually overwhelm the positions. The approach is working, slowly, but it's working at the cost of between 1,500 and 2,000 soldiers per day. So we come to the final question we'll ask in this video. What do these record-breaking numbers of troop losses mean for Putin? For one, Russia is starting to get desperate for a peace deal soon because it's running out of soldiers. That's according to The Conversation, which reveals that Russia is struggling to recruit the soldiers it needs to replenish its massive losses in Kursk and eastern Ukraine. That assertion is backed up by the fact that Putin has happily welcomed over 10,000 North Korean soldiers into his country to fight in Kursk. That's not something he would need to do if he was able to recruit enough soldiers to handle the problem himself, because taking those soldiers means he's now indebted to North Korean President Kim Jong-un. Russia doesn't want to be in this position. Its closest ally in the war is the only nation that is more of a global pariah than Russia. There's also the more tangible recruitment problems Russia faces. The BBC reports that NATO and Western military officials believe that Putin is managing to recruit around 20,000 new soldiers to Russia's military every month. Think about what that means in the context of November's record-breaking losses. Russia is only recruiting less than half the soldiers it needs to account for the losses as massive as the 45,720 experienced in November. Even more worrying for Russia is that these 20,000 per month are predominantly brand new soldiers. Some may be mercenaries and others with experience in combat, but most are wet behind the ears and likely to be sent to the front lines within weeks of recruitment, where they'll offer little more than being cannon fodder for Ukraine's guns. Putin is trying to get around this problem. At the beginning of November, Russia changed how it delivered draft notices. Rather than sending them via mail, the military now delivers them online. As soon as the notice arrives in an inbox, whoever receives it is immediately barred from leaving Russia, else they'll face stiff penalties, including jail sentences. No man in Russia is safe from this approach, assuming that the state has their records. Paying tax, renewing a driver's license, and anything else that requires interaction with state services is enough for the unfortunate individual to put themselves in line for Putin's draft. The tactics aren't going to work. Putin has already broken Russia's back when it comes to manpower. He's using these types of sneaky tactics to get more recruits because he's terrified of the public backlash he'll face if he creates a new round of mobilization. The simple fact is that Russia is running out of people to send to the front lines at a time when it's losing more soldiers than ever before. November 2024 may have been the month when Russia made substantial gains in eastern Ukraine and managed to retake 40% of its lost territory in Kursk. However, it's also the month where it broke records for the number of its soldiers lost or killed on the battlefield. When combined with the collapse of the ruble and Ukraine's newfound ability to launch long-range missiles at Russia, we may well be looking at the beginning of the end of Putin's ability to sustain his intense assaults on Ukrainian positions. But what do you think about Russia's November 2024 losses? Will Putin be able to replenish his ailing military with more people and equipment? Or is Russia's leader just waiting for President-elect Donald Trump to introduce his peace plan so he can exit his special military operation while claiming some semblance of a victory? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, and thank you for watching the video.